The morning bells chimed across the Galactic Engineering Institute as Professor Veltar shuffled into his classroom, carrying a stack of data tablets and wearing his usual expression of mild irritation. His 4 arms moved in practiced coordination as he arranged his teaching materials while students from 12 different worlds filed into their seats. The Catherian professor had been teaching basic construction courses for over 300 years, and today's lesson was one of his favorites because it was so beautifully simple. Tom Bradley slipped into the back row just as the professor began speaking. The human exchange student had learned to arrive exactly on time rather than early, having discovered that his habit of asking preliminary questions annoyed most of his instructors. He pulled out his notepad and waited, watching as his classmates settled into their seats with the casual confidence of species that had been building things in space for millennia. Professor Veltar activated the holographic projector with a gesture of his upper right arm while his lower arms continued organizing papers. A 3-dimensional image of a barren moon appeared in the center of the classroom, rotating slowly to show its cratered surface and thin atmosphere readings. Today you will demonstrate your grasp of fundamental shelter construction, the professor announced, his clicking voice translated into standard galactic through the universal communicators each student wore. Moonbase Gamma 7 has been prepared with basic construction materials and standard tools. Your assignment is to build a simple shelter that can house 1 occupant for 7 rotations. The hologram zoomed in to show a flat area marked with survey, stakes, and neat piles of prefabricated building components. Standard atmospheric processors, basic power cells, simple structural elements, and emergency life support systems were arranged in orderly rows. Everything needed for a basic shelter was there, cataloged and ready for use. This is not a creative exercise, Professor Veltar continued, his neck scales rippling slightly as he emphasized each point. This is a test of your ability to follow established protocols and work within specified parameters. The galactic construction standards exist for good reasons, developed over thousands of years by civilizations far more experienced than any individual student. Tom noticed his classmates nodding in understanding. Most were already sketching simple box-like structures in their notebooks, calculating minimum space requirements and basic atmospheric sealing needs. The Zentarian student was drawing what looked like an efficient cylinder. The Drachmarian was outlining a traditional dome design. Everything was proceeding exactly as the professor expected. The professor walked between the rows of seats, his 4 arms clasped behind his back in the manner of Catherian elders. You have 7 standard galactic days to complete construction. Transportation to the moon begins tomorrow morning. Remember, this exercise evaluates your competence in following directions, not your ability to innovate or exceed requirements. Several students raised appendages to ask questions about specific technical requirements. How much interior space was needed? What were the minimum power reserves? Should they plan for any particular environmental hazards? The professor answered each question with precise specifications, clearly pleased that his students were thinking in terms of meeting exact requirements rather than wild experimentation. Tom listened carefully to each question and answer, but found himself studying the terrain scans displayed on the hologram. The moon's surface showed interesting geological features that his classmates seemed to be ignoring. Mineral deposits that could affect excavation, geothermal activity that might provide power opportunities, seismic patterns that suggested potential instability. His human brain automatically began cataloging potential problems and opportunities that weren't mentioned in the assignment parameters. When the other students finished their questions, Tom raised his hand. Professor Veltar's optical organs focused on him with barely concealed reluctance. The human exchange student had been source of several uncomfortable discussions during his semester at the Institute, always asking questions that seemed to miss the point of assignments. Yes, Bradley? Professor, when you specify a simple shelter, are there particular restrictions on structural reinforcement or utility systems beyond the basic life support requirements? The professor's scales rippled in what Tom had learned to recognize as amusement mixed with condescension. Bradley, this is a shelter construction exercise, not a military fortification project. Build something that maintains atmospheric pressure and temperature within acceptable ranges. Follow the standard shelter protocols outlined in your basic engineering texts. Do not overcomplicate a simple assignment. Tom nodded politely and made notes in his pad, but something in his expression made Professor Veltar pause. There was a calculating look in the human's forward-facing eyes that suggested he was already planning something far beyond the scope of the assignment. The professor had seen that expression before when students were about to make expensive mistakes. Remember, Bradley, the professor added with emphasis, this exercise tests your ability to work within established parameters, not your tendency toward excessive elaboration. Simple means simple. Understood, Professor, Tom replied, but his pen continued moving across his notepad long after the other students had finished their sketches. As the class period ended and students began filing out to prepare for transport to the construction site, Tom remained seated, studying the holographic display of the moon's surface with unusual intensity. His classmates chatted excitedly about their straightforward construction plans while gathering their materials, but the human seemed to be calculating something entirely different. Professor Veltar watched Tom with growing unease. In his 3 centuries of teaching, he had learned to recognize the signs of students who were about to exceed assignment parameters in problematic ways. The human's focused attention on geological surveys and infrastructure possibilities suggested he was missing the fundamental point of the exercise. The assignment was designed to test competence in following directions and working with standard materials according to established procedures. It was not meant to showcase individual creativity or demonstrate advanced engineering concepts. Simple shelter meant simple shelter, nothing more and nothing less. Yet something in Tom's manner suggested he was approaching the problem from an entirely different perspective. The professor made a mental note to monitor the human's progress carefully. Exchange students from newer civilizations often struggled with the concept of working within established galactic standards rather than improvising solutions based on their primitive homeworld experiences. As Tom finally gathered his materials and headed toward the door, he paused to take one more look at the holographic moon display. His expression showed the kind of serious concentration that made Professor Veltar distinctly nervous about what the human might consider a simple shelter. The transport shuttle hummed quietly as it descended toward Moonbase Gamma 7, carrying 12 eager students and their construction equipment. Through the viewport, the lunar surface spread out below them like a gray canvas marked with impact craters and ancient lava flows. Most students pressed against the windows, pointing out landmarks and discussing their simple shelter plans with excitement. Tom sat quietly in his assigned seat, reviewing technical specifications on his tablet, while the other students chatted. He had spent the previous evening studying geological surveys and atmospheric data that went far beyond what was required for the assignment. While his classmates had focused on meeting minimum requirements, Tom had been calculating load-bearing capacities and thermal dynamics that seemed completely unnecessary for a 7-day shelter exercise. Professor Veltar moved through the shuttle's passenger compartment, checking on each student's preparation and answering last-minute questions. The Zentorian student showed him efficiently calculated cubic footage requirements. The Drachmarian displayed structural stress calculations for dome construction under low-gravity conditions. Each presentation demonstrated exactly the kind of methodical preparation the professor expected from competent students. When he reached Tom's seat, the human looked up from a tablet screen filled with complex diagrams that made Professor Veltar's optical organs widen in surprise. Instead of simple shelter sketches, Tom's screen showed what appeared to be architectural plans for a multi-level facility with extensive underground components and sophisticated utility systems. Bradley, the professor said carefully, these appear to be rather elaborate plans for a basic shelter assignment. Tom turned his tablet so the professor could see the full scope of his design. The blueprints revealed a structure that extended deep into the lunar surface, with multiple chambers connected by reinforced corridors. Power systems included backup generators and what looked like geothermal tapping equipment. Water recycling. Systems were more complex than those found on some space stations. "I wanted to make sure I covered all the basics," Tom explained with apparent sincerity. "The assignment calls for housing one occupant for 7 rotations while maintaining life support. These plans ensure those requirements can be met even if several major systems fail simultaneously." Professor Veltar studied the blueprints with growing amazement and concern. The human had designed what was essentially a small underground base capable of supporting extended operations far beyond the assignment parameters. The structural engineering alone represented work that would challenge graduate-level students, yet Tom presented it as routine preparation for a simple exercise. "But why build something so complex?" the professor asked. "The assignment specifically called for a simple shelter, not a permanent installation." Tom's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to explain his approach. "On my homeworld, when we build in hostile environments, we plan for problems we hope never happen. Simple shelter means something that can keep you alive when everything goes wrong, not just when everything goes right." The shuttle touched down at the construction site, and students began unloading their equipment with eager enthusiasm. Professor Veltar watched as each student claimed a section of the prepared construction area and began assembling their straightforward shelters according to standard procedures. Everything proceeded exactly as expected, with efficient progress towards simple, functional structures, except for Tom's construction site. Instead of beginning assembly of prefabricated shelter components, the human had started a comprehensive survey of his assigned area using equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than necessary for a basic construction project. He moved methodically across the ground, taking measurements and samples while his classmates were already connecting power systems and installing atmospheric processors. By the end of the second day, the difference in approach became impossible to ignore. Other students had made substantial progress assembling their simple shelters, with several already testing life support systems and preparing for occupancy trials. Tom, meanwhile, had barely begun construction but had completely mapped the subsurface geology of his construction site. Professor Veltar approached Tom's work area on the morning of the third day, expecting to find a student falling behind schedule due to unnecessary preparation. Instead, he discovered that the human had excavated a foundation that extended far beyond what any reasonable interpretation of the assignment could justify. The excavation was precise and professionally executed, but it was clearly intended for a structure several times larger than required. "Bradley," the professor called out, his forearms waving in agitation. "What is the meaning of this extensive excavation?" Tom emerged from what appeared to be the beginning of an underground chamber system, his environmental suit covered in lunar dust, but his manner completely calm and professional. "Good morning, Professor. I'm making excellent progress on the foundation systems." "This is not a foundation for a simple shelter," Professor Veltar protested, gesturing at the excavated area. "This appears to be preparation for a major installation. The assignment called for basic accommodation, not an underground complex." Tom pulled up his tablet and showed the professor detailed construction schedules that demonstrated how his seemingly excessive preparation would actually accelerate the building process once he began assembly. The foundation work that appeared to be over-engineering was actually part of an integrated construction plan that would produce a more robust final structure. "I understand the assignment requirements," Tom said patiently. "One occupant, 7 rotations, maintained life support, within acceptable parameters. My design meets those specifications while providing reasonable safety margins for unexpected situations." Professor Veltar examined the construction plans with growing bewilderment. The human had interpreted reasonable safety margins to mean structural integrity that could withstand direct impact from small meteorites, power systems with triple redundancy, and environmental controls capable of maintaining perfect conditions regardless of external circumstances. But why? the professor demanded. Why build something so elaborate when a simple prefabricated shelter would meet all assignment requirements? Tom paused in his work and looked directly at the professor with an expression of complete seriousness. Because humans learned long ago that when you're far from home in a dangerous place, there's no such thing as over-prepared. We build for the worst situation we can imagine, not the best situation we hope for. As if responding to his words, a minor seismic tremor shook the lunar surface. The vibration was barely noticeable, well within normal parameters for the geologically active moon. But while other students looked up nervously from their simple shelter assembly, Tom's reinforced foundation didn't register the slightest movement. Professor Veltar realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his 3 centuries of teaching. The human wasn't trying to show off or exceed assignment requirements out of arrogance. He was simply applying construction standards that assumed survival depended on preparing for catastrophic failure rather than optimal conditions. The professor found himself both fascinated and deeply concerned about what Tom considered normal preparation for a simple construction project. Work lights illuminated Tom's construction site throughout the 4th night as the human continued assembly of what was becoming the most talked-about project in the history of the Galactic Engineering Institute's practical exercises. Word had spread through the orbital station that the exchange student was building something extraordinary, and faculty members found excuses to visit the lunar surface just to observe his progress. Unlike his classmates who worked during standard shifts and rested in temporary shelters, Tom maintained nearly continuous construction activity. His environmental suit's enhanced life support allowed him to work longer hours, while his methodical approach meant that every installation was completed correctly the first time. There was no wasted motion, no rework, no corrections needed, as the structure took shape. Professor Veltar had taken to making daily inspection visits, officially to monitor compliance with safety regulations, but actually because he found himself genuinely fascinated by the human's construction methodology. Tom worked with tools and techniques that were simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Every procedure followed established engineering principles, but applied in ways that produced capabilities far beyond standard expectations. Your power distribution system, the professor observed, studying a control panel that looked more sophisticated than those found on military installations. It appears to have multiple backup generators and what looks like a geothermal tap. This seems excessive for a 7-day occupation period. Tom paused in his installation of what appeared to be a complete water heating and circulation system throughout the underground facility. Standard practice for remote construction, he replied matter-of-factly. Power failure in a hostile environment means death, so you install enough backup systems to handle any reasonable emergency scenario. The professor's neck scales rippled as he processed this information. But 3 separate backup power systems? And geothermal tapping equipment that could operate for decades? This goes far beyond reasonable emergency scenarios. Tom straightened and looked at the professor with the patient expression he used when explaining human engineering philosophy to alien colleagues who couldn't quite grasp the underlying principles. Professor, reasonable emergency scenarios include solar flares that knock out primary power, equipment failures that cascade through backup systems, and situations where evacuation becomes impossible for extended periods. As if summoned by his words, alerts began sounding from the orbital monitoring station. A solar storm, previously predicted to miss their system entirely, had changed course and was now heading directly toward their location. Within hours, electromagnetic interference would make space travel dangerous and could potentially damage electronic equipment on the lunar surface. Other students received emergency notifications instructing them to prepare their shelters for potential power disruptions and equipment failures. Standard protocols called for shutting down non-essential systems and relying on emergency batteries until the storm passed. Several students discovered that their simple shelters lacked sufficient shielding for their electronic components. Tom received the same emergency notifications, but continued his construction work without apparent concern. His power systems automatically adjusted to storm conditions, switching to underground cable routing that provided natural electromagnetic shielding. When other students began reporting power fluctuations and system warnings, Tom's facility showed no change in operational status. "Bradley," Professor Veltar called over the communication system, "are you prepared for the solar storm conditions?" "Already prepared, Professor," Tom replied calmly. "All critical systems are hardened against electromagnetic interference, and we have sufficient power reserves to maintain full operations throughout the predicted storm duration." The professor watched his monitoring displays in amazement as the storm began affecting the lunar surface. One by one, other student construction projects showed stress indicators and power problems. Emergency protocols were activated for several shelters as their basic systems struggled with the electromagnetic interference. Tom's facility registered the storm on its sensors but showed no operational impact whatsoever. In fact, the geothermal systems he had installed were actually providing more power than needed, creating a surplus that he offered to share with students whose shelters were experiencing difficulties. "This is impossible," Professor Veltar muttered, studying readings that showed Tom's construction not only surviving the storm, but functioning at optimal capacity throughout the crisis. "How did you anticipate these specific conditions?" Tom's voice came back over the communication system with characteristic calm. "I didn't anticipate these specific conditions, Professor. I just built assuming that whatever could go wrong probably would go wrong, and usually at the worst possible time." By the 5th day, Tom's facility had become an unofficial headquarters for storm monitoring and emergency coordination. His communication systems were more powerful than the temporary equipment other students had brought. His power surplus was keeping several failing shelters operational. Most remarkably, his environmental systems were providing conditions so comfortable that faculty members were requesting permission to use his facility for their own shelter during the storm. Professor Veltar found himself spending more time at Tom's construction site than at his own temporary shelter, partly for the superior conditions, but mostly because he was witnessing engineering principles that challenged everything he thought he understood about construction standards. The human had somehow acquired additional materials through trades, with other students exchanging his expertise in solving their technical problems for components he needed to complete his ambitious design. Students who had initially viewed his project as unnecessary over-engineering were now competing to provide him with materials in exchange for consultation on their own construction problems. "Your atmospheric processing system," one Drachmarian student commented during a visit, "it maintains perfect temperature and humidity, while our standard units struggle with basic atmospheric pressure." Tom showed him the integrated environmental controls that managed everything from air quality to temperature distribution throughout the multi-chamber facility. "The key is redundancy and automated adjustment," he explained. "Instead of one system trying to handle all environmental control, you have multiple systems that work together and compensate for each other's limitations." The visiting student took careful notes while Professor Veltar observed the interaction with growing realization that his human exchange student wasn't just completing an assignment. Tom was demonstrating construction philosophy that could revolutionize how the galactic community approached building in hostile environments. What had started as a simple shelter exercise was becoming a masterclass in comprehensive emergency preparation that would be studied for years to come. The 6th day dawned with ominous atmospheric readings as Moonbase Gamma 7 prepared to experience one of its notorious weather events. What had started as a routine solar storm was combining with unusual lunar atmospheric conditions to create a perfect storm of challenging environmental factors. Seismic monitoring stations reported increasing geological activity, while atmospheric processors showed pressure fluctuations that exceeded normal operational parameters. Professor Veltar monitored the developing situation from his command post, Aboard the orbital station, watching weather tracking displays that showed conditions rapidly deteriorating beyond what anyone had anticipated. The original assignment had been scheduled during a stable weather period, but lunar weather patterns were notoriously unpredictable. What should have been a calm construction period was turning into a significant test of every shelter's capabilities. Emergency. Protocols activated across the lunar surface as automated systems began securing construction sites and preparing for severe weather conditions. Standard procedures called for students to seal their shelters and wait out the storm using emergency life support reserves. Most of the simple shelters were designed to handle routine environmental challenges, not the extreme conditions that were rapidly developing. The first shelter failures began within hours of the storm's arrival. The Xentorian students' efficient, cylindrical structure developed atmospheric leaks when seismic activity shifted its foundation. The Drachmarian dome's power system overloaded trying to compensate for extreme temperature fluctuations. One by one, emergency evacuation signals began activating as student shelters reached the limits of their capabilities. Professor Veltar coordinated emergency rescues as students were transported back to the orbital station, their simple shelters unable to cope with conditions that exceeded design specifications. This was exactly the kind of situation that assignment protocols were designed to avoid, but lunar weather refused to cooperate with academic schedules. Through it all, one shelter showed absolutely no signs of distress. Tom's underground facility not only weathered the increasingly severe conditions without apparent effort, but its occupants were reporting environmental conditions that seemed absurdly comfortable considering the chaos outside. Bradley, Professor Veltar called over the emergency communication channel, report your structural integrity status and occupant condition. Tom's voice came back clear and calm, without any of the stress indicators that characterized transmissions from other shelter sites. All systems operating within normal parameters, Professor. Internal environment is stable at optimal comfort settings. We're monitoring the storm through our sensor array, but the facility's structural systems aren't registering any stress indicators. The professor stared at his monitoring displays in disbelief, while other shelters were sending emergency signals and requesting immediate evacuation. Tom's facility was operating as if the severe storm conditions outside didn't exist. Internal temperature remained perfectly stable. Power systems showed steady output from multiple sources. Most remarkably, atmospheric conditions inside the facility were actually superior to those maintained on the orbital station. How many occupants are you currently housing? The professor asked, noting that several students had requested shelter in Tom's facility rather than emergency evacuation. Currently housing 8 occupants comfortably, Tom replied. The facility was designed with expansion capability, so we have plenty of room and resource capacity for additional personnel if needed. Professor Veltar checked his records and discovered that Tom's assignment had specified single-occupant accommodation for 7 days. Yet somehow the human had built a facility that was successfully housing multiple occupants during extreme emergency conditions while maintaining environmental standards that exceeded optimal ratings. Even more impressive were the reports coming from inside Tom's facility. Students who had taken shelter there described conditions that sounded like luxury accommodation rather than emergency shelter. Hot water for cleaning and food preparation, comfortable sleeping areas with individual climate control, communication equipment that provided clear contact with the orbital station despite electromagnetic interference that was disrupting other systems. Bradley, the professor called again. Are you able to provide any assistance to other construction sites experiencing difficulties? Already coordinating with 3 other sites, Tom replied. We're sharing power through temporary cable connections and providing communication relay services for facilities with damaged equipment. Our manufacturing capability is producing replacement components for critical system repairs. Manufacturing capability. The professor realized that Tom had somehow included production facilities in his simple shelter that could create replacement parts for other students' failing equipment. What kind of construction philosophy included on-site manufacturing as a standard feature of basic accommodation? As the storm intensified throughout the day, Tom's facility served as an emergency coordination center for the entire construction exercise. His communication systems were more reliable than the temporary equipment other students had brought. His power generation capacity was sufficient to support multiple failing shelters. His structural integrity was so superior that he was able to send out repair teams to assist other sites while maintaining perfect internal conditions. The professor found himself coordinating the emergency response from Tom's facility rather than from his orbital command post, simply because the humans' equipment was more capable and reliable than the sophisticated systems aboard the space station. Students and faculty gathered in the comfortable underground chambers while monitoring equipment, tracked storm conditions, and coordinated rescue operations. "This is unprecedented," Professor Veltar admitted to Tom as they watched displays showing the humans' facility serving as headquarters for operations that should have required a major military installation. "Your single-occupant shelter is functioning as a complete emergency operations center." Tom looked up from a control panel where he was managing power distribution to multiple external sites while simultaneously coordinating communication services for the entire construction exercise. "This is actually pretty basic emergency response capability," he said with characteristic understated manner. "On my homeworld, any remote installation needs to be able to serve as a regional support center if necessary." The professor stared at Tom with growing realization that he was witnessing construction standards that operated on assumptions completely different from established galactic practices. Where traditional engineering built structures to meet specified requirements under expected conditions, the human approach built for unknown emergencies under impossible circumstances. By evening, Tom's simple shelter was supporting the survival and comfort of 12 occupants, providing power to 4 external sites, serving as communication relay for the entire lunar surface operation, and manufacturing replacement parts for failing equipment across multiple construction projects. All while maintaining internal environmental conditions superior to most luxury accommodations in the galactic core systems. Morning arrived on the 7th day with crystalline clarity as the storm systems finally dissipated and Moonbase Gamma 7 revealed the aftermath of the previous day's chaos. Across the construction site, damaged shelters and scattered equipment told the story of a weather event that had pushed every structure to its absolute limits. Emergency crews moved between construction sites, assessing damage and beginning cleanup operations. Professor Veltar stood outside Tom's facility, watching as students emerged from the underground complex, looking remarkably refreshed and comfortable. After spending the night in what amounted to luxury accommodations, they had slept in individual climate-controlled chambers, eaten hot meals prepared in a full kitchen facility, and enjoyed recreational amenities that would have been impressive on a permanent colony installation. The contrast with other construction sites was stark and undeniable. Simple shelters that had been designed to meet minimum assignment requirements lay in various states of damage and disrepair. Some had suffered complete structural failure, others had maintained basic life support but provided miserable conditions for their occupants. Several had been completely evacuated when their systems failed entirely during the storm. Tom's facility stood unmarked by the severe weather, looking as solid and permanent as if it had been built decades ago rather than assembled in less than a week. External sensors and communication equipment continued operating normally. Power systems showed steady output from multiple sources. Most remarkably, the facility appeared ready to operate independently for months or even years without any external support. "Final inspection time," Professor Veltar announced, though his formal tone couldn't hide his fascination with what he was about to examine. Over the past week, his understanding of construction engineering had been fundamentally challenged by watching the humans' approach to a simple assignment. Tom led the professor and a growing group of faculty observers through his completed facility, explaining each system with the casual competence of someone describing routine engineering practices. What they discovered was a masterpiece of integrated design that operated on principles none of them had encountered in centuries of galactic engineering education. The underground complex included multiple chambers connected by reinforced corridors that could be sealed independently for damage control. Power systems drew from geothermal sources, solar collectors, and backup fuel cells, with automated switching between sources based on availability and demand. Water recycling and heating systems provided unlimited hot water while maintaining perfect purity standards. Communication equipment included long-range transmitters, emergency beacons, and relay stations that could coordinate rescue operations across an entire planetary surface. Manufacturing facilities could produce replacement parts, tools, and even construction materials using automated systems that required minimal maintenance. Most impressive was the integration of defensive capabilities that Tom had incorporated as routine safety features. Observation posts provided complete surveillance coverage of the surrounding area. Structural design could withstand direct impact from small meteorites or deliberate attack. Emergency lockdown procedures could seal the facility against external threats while maintaining full operational capability. Your assignment, Professor Veltar said carefully, was to construct a basic shelter for one occupant during a 7-day period. Yes, sir, Tom replied with complete sincerity. This facility meets those requirements while providing reasonable safety margins for unexpected circumstances. The professor's forearms moved in complex patterns as he processed the gap between assignment requirements and delivered capabilities. Bradley, this installation could support a dozen occupants for months. It includes manufacturing capability, defensive systems, and communication equipment that exceeds military specifications. How do you define reasonable safety margins, Neboy? Considered the question with the serious attention he gave to all engineering discussions. Professor, reasonable safety margins assume that everything that can go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible time. Power fails during emergencies. Communication equipment breaks when you need help most. Structural damage occurs during severe weather. Enemy action targets your most vulnerable systems. Enemy action? The professor repeated. This is a peaceful moon used for educational exercises. Today it's peaceful, Tom agreed. But situations change. Political conditions shift. Natural disasters create desperate people who might threaten installations. Pirates target isolated facilities. When you build something, you have to assume it might face threats you didn't anticipate when construction began. Professor Veltar realized he was listening to construction philosophy that operated on assumptions completely foreign to galactic civilization. For thousands of years, established societies had built structures assuming stable political conditions, reliable supply chains, and predictable environmental factors. The human approach assumed chaos, conflict, and catastrophic system failures as normal operating conditions. A delegation of senior faculty had arrived from the orbital station to examine Tom's construction, drawn by reports that seemed too extraordinary to believe. As they toured the facility, their amazement grew with each revealed capability. Here was engineering that combined the best features of military installations, research facilities, luxury accommodations, and manufacturing centers, in a package that had been assembled by one student in less than a week. This changes everything, whispered the Dean of Advanced Engineering as she examined Tom's automated manufacturing systems. If this represents standard human construction practices, we need to completely revise our understanding of infrastructure. Development. Tom overheard the comment and looked genuinely surprised by the attention his work was receiving. This is actually pretty modest construction by human standards, he said. I was working with limited materials and a tight deadline. A proper human outpost would include expanded manufacturing, extended defensive networks, and accommodation for population growth over time. The profound silence that followed his statement spoke volumes about the impact of his words on the assembled faculty. What Tom considered basic preparation represented capabilities that most galactic civilizations would classify as advanced military engineering. Professor Veltar found himself facing the uncomfortable realization that his centuries of teaching experience had not prepared him for this moment. The human exchange student had not simply completed an assignment. He had demonstrated construction methods that revealed fundamental weaknesses in established galactic engineering standards. "Bradley," the professor said finally, "I believe we need to discuss redesigning our entire curriculum around what you call crisis assumption engineering. Would you be willing to teach advanced courses in human construction methodology?" Tom smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had been properly understood and appreciated. "I'd be honored to share our techniques, Professor. Though I should warn you, once you start building the human way, it becomes very difficult to accept minimum acceptable standards as actually acceptable." As the evaluation concluded and students began preparing for transport back to the orbital station, Tom's facility continued its quiet operation. Environmental systems maintained perfect conditions. Manufacturing equipment stood ready to produce anything needed. Communication arrays monitored space traffic and weather patterns across the system. The professor's final report would note that while student Bradley had technically fulfilled all assignment requirements, the implications of his construction method suggested that galactic engineering standards required fundamental revision. The human definition of basic shelter had revealed that their civilization's approach to adequate preparation was dangerously inadequate. In his personal notes, Professor Veltar recorded his most significant observation. "The humans do not build structures to meet immediate needs. They construct the foundation elements of permanent civilization, one simple shelter at a time."